was where the major birth rate of West Indian, African Caribbeans took place on the soil. So by the time the 1980s came in, that was a vast majority of teenagers from that particular community. And we know about the sus laws, police stopping, black youths, etc. What was taking place in the workplace. If they were in a particular car, they were stopped, and it's still happening even till today. So the question is, has much changed in the last 70 years? And if it has changed, how has it changed? How has it impacted the dominant culture as well as subordinate culture? What's taking place apparently now, which is getting more common, especially with a lot of the crime that's taking place in many of the inner cities, where white families are being affected by this now. Because of integration, miscegenation, where black males, white females are coming together and having children, their children are being affected, and it's decimating and upsetting white families. And one of the things I usually say when I give lectures is basically that things don't stay contained. Things will always shift because things always spread as a result of integration. That's what integration does. So just because it may affect one particular ethnic group or racial group today, don't think it's not going to affect us tomorrow. There was a time years ago where the Irish were stigmatized. Okay? And they were badly stigmatized. They were stigmatized badly even in the Caribbean islands. Badly in the Americas. They were looking for refuge. They were looking for some place for liberty for themselves. Yeah, we know what took place in the 1980s with, the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, because they had an Irish accent and the type of war and the occupation that took place in Ireland, they were being selected and incarcerated. Okay, miscarriages of justice took place. So when I'm trying to give this presentation, I want you to give an overall understanding, not just of looking at the racial conflicts that took place within a society, look at the ethnic conflicts that took place between different peoples. We know in America, for instance, a lot of those ethnic conflicts took place. Believe the kid, he was from Ireland. Okay? The English were the dominant force within America, the Anglo-Americans. Okay? Similar sort of wars were taken to the Caribbean. So the Europeans or the British people had their internal wars with themselves in other people's country. If you look at the American Revolution, for instance, the American Civil War, where British or European people are fighting over fighting their wars on someone else's land, for someone else's land. So this is what I mean about integration, about conflict. Look at prejudice now. When people look at discrimination, now discrimination, unfortunately, is being downplayed to a certain extent, and a lot of it is because of the height of miscegenation, mixed race relationships. So many people in dominant culture don't feel safe to speak out against these things because they might actually offend someone who may have a child or might be married to someone from this particular community. So what has taken place is that racism, discrimination, prejudice have literally gone underground. And slowly we're starting to see its head rise again, its ugly head rise again. And one of the things I want to emphasize as well, unfortunately, when immigrants come to this country, it's unfortunate that it is foisted onto the people. One of the problems I have as a historian, when I look at what took place during the Windrush period, was the fact is that the people, their local people, the nationals of this country, were not educated enough about the people who were coming over to live in this country, to work in this country, or to stay in this country. And what has taken place with immigration over the last 15 to 20 years is a similar thing. The educational system in this country needs to educate the dominant culture about the cultural differences of other people, people's language, people's morals, norms, customs, values. So when those people do come to the country, there's some sort of understanding, there is some sort of knowledge, rather than keeping the people into the dark and just expecting them to mix. Because this was a lot of the conflicts that took place with the Windrush generation. When they moved into some of these inner city areas, which are predominantly, lived in by white people, the hostility, the contention took place. It proliferated because the people who lived in those communities were not psychologically prepared for that difference. Okay? For these people, where do they come from? What are they doing here? Why are they here? These question marks, they were just thrown and foisted into the working class community, and the working class whites were basically told, just get on with it. No assistance, no support, no education whatsoever. And it's unfortunate these things are happening, and it's still happening. It is still permeating in today's society, okay? Especially with the immigration situation today, especially with the wars that are taking place in these countries. So when we look at prejudice, prejudice can manifest itself in three ways. There's a cognitive, affective, and cognitive. People think when you deal with prejudice, discrimination, racism, these type of things, you've got to say it outright. No, there's a pervasiveness to this reality, such as the cognitive. Okay, a belief, a thought, a notion. It's something which is up here. It may not be spoken, it may not be said verbally, but it exists up here. This still permeates and exists in modern day society. It's still with us today, okay? But now we're seeing its ugly head rise. And what has taken place in the United States of America has sparked off this type of uncomfortability for many minority groups that live in this country. We know that Britain as an empire, as a country, yeah, it's always used cheap labor from abroad to bring over here to work. That's exactly what they did during the Windrush period. And is exactly what they're doing today, by not educating their people of the reality of what's taking place. We know with the exploitation of resources in other people's countries and land, because Britain relies on this. This is why I gave the foundational principle right at the beginning about the demarcation of the world, Europeans scrambling for that particular word. This is where the race comes from. The word race actually comes from when Europeans were racing down in the 1600s to develop the Americas, the Caribbean islands. This is where the word race came from. They were racing down. And when they went and they encountered those individuals, they encountered those people, they started to realize that these people would have a different culture, different language, different skin colors. So what happened eventually, the Europeans had to negotiate this. They had to share the Atlantic. They had to trade amongst themselves. So the word race was taken from those 7 or 8 European powers who were controlling the Atlantic, and it was put on the different people of color. The red, the yellow, the brown, and the black, with the whites being up the top. And then the whites were stratified even further, where the English were up the top, then it was the Scottish, then it was the Welsh, and then it was the Irish. Okay, this is how we were stratified. That's how we were stratified in this country. It was certainly stratified like that in the Caribbean islands. And even in Africa, if you look at East Africa, where there was mandates and protectorates of those particular countries, because in the 1880s, the European nations got together. Okay, and when they got together, they sat around the table, 11 nations sat around the table to carve up Africa for its resources, for its minerals, for its commodities. And then when they sat around the table in order to carve this up, many of the abolitionists that lived at that particular time were saying, rather than take the country off them, let's just trade with them. Why take the country? Why are you sending working class whites to fight the wars for the aristocracy and for the crown in this country? Why are we doing this? So there was many people in this country who was opposed to the occupation of Africa, because they know that their sons, at least one of their sons, okay, one of their uncles, okay, one of their fathers, grandfathers, would be sent off to war, and nothing really given to the people when they come to this country. Because even if you look what took place during the Second World War, okay, blacks couldn't live in many places. Many of those houses, white women owned, and they were given places to a lot of black men. A lot of black men were living in these places. You know, so white women in themselves saved a lot of black men from sleeping on the streets in this country. Okay, because their husbands had died. They weren't getting any assistance from the government. Okay, we know that the health service came and the welfare state came in the 1940s. But very little assistance was given to women, single women who were bringing up kids on their own, and how to maintain the mortgages to these properties. Okay? So they saved a lot of black males from being homeless. This needs to come out. This needs to be recognized. This needs to be realized. Okay? The type of relationship that people have with one another, showing mercy to a particular person, to a particular group. And we're still seeing it happening even until today. When I say history repeats itself, believe it does repeat itself. It's happening today as we speak now. Okay? Homelessness is something which is becoming more and more common now. As we get an influx of immigrants coming in, we're seeing more and more homeless people of the dominant culture now entering the streets, sleeping on the streets. okay? You know, you have jobs and factories being sent abroad, okay? Which mean high unemployment. And then immigrant groups who are coming over here are being blamed. Rather than blame the government for these reforms and for these changes, they're blaming the immigrant groups, okay? Use as scapegoats. And very little is being done to clarify the reality of this situation. Then we look at the affective elements of prejudice, looking at feelings and emotions, and then we got the cognitive, which is looking at behavior performance. This is verbalized in some way. This is physicalized in some way. It's acting out. It's acting it out in some way. So when people will say, well, look, racism, discrimination, prejudice doesn't exist no more, it can exist within those three factors, within that stratified field that I've shown you there. Let me just finish off with this. Can I still carry on? Yeah? Okay. Right. In the 1960s, there were 3 race relation acts which were passed, were very important in order to increase integration into this society. Because the way society was stratified, the way in which certain groups of people were marginalized, and not groups of people were marginalized because of skin color, the way people were marginalized because of their gender. So if we look at the 1965 Race Relation Act, which was passed because of racial segregation, institutions. They couldn't go to seasides, sea resorts, hotels, restaurants. That was the reality right up until 1965. The government had to step in and to make those changes. So when we look at racial segregation and racial prejudice, why do they like to focus on what took place in North America, but not what took place on their own doorstep? Why ain't this being spoken about? Black History Month is supposed to bring this to light, to show the type of changes, to show that integration has worked to a large extent in many communities, but it doesn't show this. Then we had 1969, the Housing Act. Like I said, a lot of black men who were carpenters and builders came over here to work into that field, work into that trade. Okay? They can build houses, but they couldn't live in them. Where were they actually living? Why was this taking place? So the government had to step in. They couldn't even own houses. There was what was known as the partner system that West Indians would do, where a group of men primarily would pool their money together, okay? Because they had no form of collateral when they went to the banks to try to get loans. And they didn't believe that they were citizens of this country. So what they would do, they would pool their money together. They would pull the name out of a hat. The first name which would come out, that would be the person who would purchase a house, and the money would still be pooled in, okay? These were communities. This is how they end up having ownership of homes. No assistance from the government, no assistance from the banking institutions whatsoever. And the banking institutions, especially like if you look at Lloyd's of London, made immense wealth from the Caribbean islands alone. Immense wealth from the Caribbean islands alone, okay? The first thing that it traded on was human cargo that looked like me. And that same banking institution would not recognize its duty now to its former slaves. Barclays Bank is another institution. When we talk about reparations as an example, reparations is about us as West Indians, African Caribbeans, not with the working class of this country. Reparations is really and truly about the banking institutions out there, those national institutions, those national organizations that created immense wealth from free labor. And those people just want a little in society and being denied these basic rights, okay? And then we had in 1976, we have the Race Relation Act, which was passed. That was actually passed in order for more integration in employment. You talk about 1976. The reason why they passed that, because a year before that, they passed the Equal Pay Act. It's only in August they were talking about, or July and August they were talking about, there's a marginalization and disparity between female workers, who were whites, and the white counterparts, you know, as news presenters. That white males are still getting paid immense more for doing the same job as women. That law was passed a year before. The reason why they had to pass this law and integrate is because when they passed the Equal Pay Act in 1975 did not include people from the colonies, people who lived here, people who were born here, from minority groups. Okay? So when they passed it for women, say, for instance, it did not include black women. It did not include black women. It didn't include black men. It was European or British society amongst themselves, the gender divide that took place in that society. That's what it was passed for. So when the government had to basically write this down and draw it up, etc., they had to include race, class, gender, elements within the minority groups, mainly blacks and Asians, because the law that came out the year before did not include black females. So in 1975-76, when white women were then receiving element of equal pay for doing the same jobs as males, black women, for instance, and black males, but primarily black women, yeah, were being paid less. This is in 1975-76. Those disparities still exist even till today. Even as a social scientist who look at the statistics, read these academic journals, they exist today. So it's not just white females who are being deprived economically from their wealth, from their labor, but minority groups as well. One of the things that minority groups are doing in this country now, they feel that they have to open up businesses, and food is one of the main things that they're going into. Okay? And they believe within the next 5 to 10 years, most of the food shops are going to be owned by someone who don't look like people from the dominant culture. The people from the dominant culture are now going into more of the services, things that are privatized. Okay? So we're seeing where the people who come in at the bottom, and the dominant culture move to the top to an extent. But we're also seeing a rise in homelessness, even with amongst the dominant culture. Why is this taking place? Why is this happening? Why do these disparities still exist? Because people say, well, why do you want to talk about this particular issue when it comes to race? What about the gender inequalities? What about this form of inequalities? We have to address them all. And unfortunately, as far as Black History Month is concerned, we get 28 to 31 days to say what we need to say, and then we go back to normality. Let's get back to normality now. We got that out of the way now. You know, black people have been instrumental in trying to make changes. We won in the educational system in this country. As an advocate, basically, of trying to integrate, because I'm an educator, as an advocate trying to get into the educational system, I do not want to see black history taught just in the history and the geography lesson. I want to see it taught in chemistry, physics, geometry, trigonometry, etc. Because when you go back to the major empires in Africa, those sciences existed. Africans, males as well as females, contribute to those disciplines. So we're not just looking, so I, as an educator, I do not want to see it just relegated to the history, to the geography lesson. It has to be all. And not just that. In the 1980s, the government wanted to come up with multicultural education because of the racial disparities that was taking place in schools. Black males, especially, were put into the remedials or to the lower bands and kept there. They were high achievers up until the age of 11 years old. And as soon as they went to secondary school, they were put into the lower bands or to the lower sets and kept there. The government decided as a form of reparations was to design what was known as the access course. The access course, which we see today, was actually introduced by the British government in order for those people who came from the black community to go back into education so they had instant access into university. But the majority of the people that took up those roles as a whole of reparations were whites, mainly white females. Black people didn't monopolize. It wasn't promoted, it wasn't shouted from the rooftops. But in the late 1980s, the government wanted to pass what was known as the, multicultural education. Okay, around about 1985, there was two main reports, the Rampton Report and the Swan Report. And basically what they were saying that if a group of people are not exposed to their history, not exposed to their experience in any of these subjects, it's going to cause for them an element of lack of self-esteem, lack of confidence, which contributes to self-worth. So the government was instrumental in trying to bring about those changes because they can see that a large amount of their population now was mixing, through marriage, through children, okay? People marrying to the family, in-laws. This became a national fact within British society. So this is how the government tried to address that. And in 1980, the government decided to abandon multicultural education and came with a national curriculum. And what the national curriculum basically did, it wanted to prevent multicultural education from being taught, because the whole idea of multicultural education was that every ethnic group which was in this country would be addressed within the classrooms. That was the idea behind multicultural education, to do something it didn't do before. Was basically educate his own people about the people who's going to eventually come here and live, rather than keep them ignorant and then saying, well, just get on with it. Because this is what they were doing. That's why there was a lot of hostilities in the 1940s, 1950s. Notting Hill Carnival came about as a result of what? The Notting Hill riots. Black people were only relegated to particular areas in London. Yeah? Whites were discontentedly against this type of integration because they weren't psychologically prepared. Riots broke out. The riot literally broke out because it was a black male who was married to a white female. And she was abused. She was called disgusting names. And then he decided to attack. And that's how it spurred off. That's how it came about. And then the Caribbean community basically got together. What can we do to try? Because we want to live with these people. Yeah, they are decent people at the end of the day. They're just a little bit ignorant, not arrogant, ignorant. They just don't know because they haven't been psychologically prepared for what has happened. We're here to stay now. They didn't tell their people this. Their people was under the impression they're going to come over here, work, and then they're going to go back. This is what they were really told. And then kids started to appear. Then the kids were being sent to the schools. Then they started to realize, wait a minute, these foreigners ain't going back. This is what they were saying. Yeah? We got to psychologically prepare the dominant culture in any country what's to come and how to cope with that reality. And by coping with that reality, it has to be put into the educational system, at least. Because if it's not taught at home and taught on school, at least the educational system could be equipped in order to do that. And that is what multicultural education is about. So what I'm going to stop here, let you ask any questions, and then hopefully I should be able to answer them. There's a microphone by here if you want to pass it round, and then people can ask their questions.
Does anyone have any questions? When the black, I think this is, can you hear me anyway? Okay, when the black men stayed here after 1919, did they have a vote?
No.
So when did black people in Britain have a vote?
They didn't really. Many of them voted to some extent. It wasn't until after the Commonwealth Act. It wasn't really until around about this particular time you start to see a lot of black votes, a lot of black suffrage within this country, around about the early 1960s. Because around about the time the comprehensive schools came in, more and more black kids who were born in the 1950s were going to those schools and coming over. So it was probably around about that time, around about 1960s. And because many of them know they were staying here now, because obviously the wages were poor, they couldn't afford to move back, build their little mansions, etc. They began to realize, look, we have to make good of a bad situation, okay? And that's when many of them decided to vote and tried to make changes, because they said at the end of the day, our children know nothing about the Caribbean islands. This is their home. Yeah, we need to try to make changes in order for them to integrate into society. And that's how that came about, basically. Any other questions?
Have you read Andrea Levitt's The Long Song?
No, I've heard about it, but I haven't read it, no.
I've read it quite recently, and it's set in the Caribbean in the 19th century when slavery was coming to an end and laws were changing. And having read that book, which had no gratuitous violence or anything, it was shocking nonetheless for how white people treated the slaves. Are they ever going to teach that in schools?
Well, this is the thing. This is the main contention behind black history being taught in school, because many teachers, and I agree with them to some extent, many white teachers feel uncomfortable. I don't even want to teach this. This is barbarity, this is hostility, this is just not right. Many of them don't want to teach it because they want to hide that fact. I think it's about time getting educators, people who know their history, because I'm an expert, this is my specialism, you know, to come in as a consultant and to say, look, how we can carve this up. Because unfortunately, as far as black history is concerned, if you go to France, if you go to Spain, you know, all those countries that colonized and had colonies in the Caribbean islands, what was the point I was trying to make? There was a point I was trying to make.
About whether to teach that.
Yeah.
The atrocities, really.
Yeah. The thing is, I think it needs to be done sophisticatedly. Yeah, where there's no ramifications for the victims as well as the perpetrators. You know, if white people see themselves as perpetrators, because I've given black history courses, for instance, you know, majority of my students have been white, mainly white females, and they always seem to feel bad. And I said, look, this is a particular period in time, you know, these things happened. But unfortunately, that was the point I was trying to make. All those Europeans who had colonies in the Caribbean islands, yeah, what you usually find is that when they talk about black history, they always like to start off in slavery. It never happens before that, unfortunately. And the educational system needs to reflect that these people had a history before slavery. They came from great cultures, empires, they were literate, they had universities, schools, there was an element of social equality with the genders, you know, some of the things I explained earlier. And I think if it's done from that perspective, then you've got the positive as well as the negative, just marry them together, as opposed to just concentrating just on slavery. You know, even if you go on to concentrate on slavery, let's have a look at not the merchant class, let's have a look at the mechanics, okay? Let's have a look at the people who built the White House. They had those skills. The people who knew geometry from Africa, those people who knew geometry, trigonometry, were able to help the Europeans who were literate to be educated, you know, to know mathematics at that particular time. Okay? The inventors, most of the things which invented in the Americas and the Caribbean islands came out of former slaves' minds. Let's educate that. Bring these different things together so you've got an element of balance. But to concentrate on the atrocities and the whippings and the beatings, the exploitation, the Middle Passage, yeah, you know, imperialism and all these other negative factors. Not look at the element of positive things that they've contributed, they've achieved and they accomplished something, is not really going to go down well for many, many teachers or the educational system accepting it to be part of the mainstream. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks for having me. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope I made it interesting. And please invite me again. Okay, thank you very much.
Wrap the film and listen to you for the rest of the morning, to be honest. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I could carry on if you want. I could speak for Wales. How long is the film on for? All supposed to be on for?
1:50.
Ooh.